Today on the MrMaple Show podcast, Tim and Sean discuss adding depth and movement to your landscape garden using Japanese maple.
Howdy, and welcome to the MrMaple Show. Y'all, today we're going to be talking about adding depth to your garden using Japanese maples, landscaping your garden by Mr. Maple, y'all. So, I'm Tim.
I'm Sean.
And we're MrMaple.com. We're a family mail order business. We do over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maples. We ship to your door. And check us out on MrMaple.com. We also do a daily YouTube video on the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. Check us out there. Make sure you're subscribed if you like gardening. And find us on your favorite podcast platform. Give us a 5-star review. We'd really appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed there as well.
So you might be wondering, what is depth in a garden, in landscaping? And depth, essentially what you're trying to do is create where you pulls you through, not just your eyes. It could be from a walkway, it could be from where you're standing, but essentially to pull you through all the way from the front of the garden all the way to the back.
So what we're talking about is designing your garden essentially to make that garden feel large. This is designing your garden to make you feel the whole garden feel very large and give you that depth in the landscape. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how do you make your garden feel large? You know, a lot of people have smaller gardens, and that's awesome. But often you want it to feel like you've got a large space out there. And how do you design your garden with the trees to really add that depth out there to really be able to appreciate the full garden?
So I always approach it that I say myself that there's 4 levels or 4 stages that you want to keep in mind. There's 3, but I always add a 4th one. But that first one is foreground. And with foreground, we're talking about the front of the garden, what lines that garden going in.
Yeah, I mean, and then we've got the midground next. And the midground is that middle area. It's not you're right up close. It's not back there in the back. It's right there in the mid area.
And then, going from there, we're going to the background. What's in the back? And that background is so important because that's what's ultimately going to pull you to, hence, the background, the back of the garden.
And then lastly, we add that vertical interest, which can be in the different stages, the foreground, the midground, or the background. But it continues throughout the entire garden to really tie that garden together and give you that depth of perception in your landscape. Now, we're going to be going through here and talking more about each of these stages. And then once we talk about those stages, we're going to come back to those stages and give you some good recommendations of Japanese maples in each of these areas. And then we're going to go through and talk about companion plants. Now, the reason we're talking about adding depth to your garden with Japanese maples is Japanese maples, they have such a diversity in size, shape, color, texture, and they're so easy to use. They're part of a low maintenance landscape that you can really enjoy. Have a tree out there that grows in value and really turns into something beautiful as it matures.
So when we get into talking about the foreground, I want to, premise this with, first off, we're going to talk about with that, we're going to start out with lower plants. Plants that stay lower to the ground, don't get too big. But don't think because you're using lower plants that this is not an important level stage to your garden. Because, and in fact, it could be one of the most important parts, because that's the first thing you're going to see walking into the garden or sitting back looking at it. That's the first impression of your garden.
Yeah, the foreground sets the stage for the rest of your landscape. If you're looking out there and you're seeing plants up close, to me, I'm someone who overdoes it. So I like to make that extremely visually appealing. I like to put things that have variegation up close, things that have interesting textures on smaller leaves up close. I like to think that, what I'm looking at is some of the coolest plants in the garden, because that's what I want to have up close when I'm walking by or from a viewpoint. Now, when we're talking about these 4 different stages, these 4 different stages can continue out throughout the entire garden. It can be your viewpoint from, you can have these 4 different stages of viewpoint from any viewpoint in the garden. That could be from a walkway. It could be from anything. And we've got a whole podcast. We've actually got a whole, not podcast, but whole video on our MrMaple Show on walkway planting with Japanese maples, landscaping your garden with by Mr. Maple. You can go check that out, that video as well.
Yeah, and that's something important to keep out. It's from any vantage or from any viewpoint from that, whether, like you say, it's from a patio or a walkway or, so keep that in mind. It's not just sitting back. But again, the point of these different stages or levels is to add depth, to pull you through, whether that means just pulling your eyes through the garden or literally pulling you to make you move down through a path.
Yeah, exactly. This could be from that path. This could be from your patio. This could be from your window, from your living room where you enjoy your garden from inside your home. So be thinking about this in a more complex way rather than just looking at it as, here's my garden from the road and here's what other people see. And that can be part of it. But think about this from where you're going to be enjoying your garden.
And, when we mention, you want to use something that's going to sit lower, something smaller, we're talking dwarfs and stuff like that. Great trees to use. But you don't want to go with something too large because you don't want to block that next level.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. There's a trade-off when you choose something that's taller in that foreground. If you're up close and you're choosing that, something taller, you're blocking something from behind, and that can be something that you may want to do. But that is, more screening. That is trying to block view of a neighbor, trying to block view of, an unsightly something you want to see, and it's not adding depth to your garden. It's actually taking depth away. So there is that depth trade-off when you put something larger in that foreground.
And when we mention stages, levels, steps, that's kind of what we're talking about. You're going from that front, that foreground, and then we move into that midground, that next level, that next step to take you from those lower, smaller plants, smaller trees to that next level. But before we jump to midground, I do want to, emphasize with the foreground to keep in mind what colors and textures and different type of foliage, because that's all going to play into moving on to a next level.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. If you're using, a lot of yellows and variegated plants in your foreground, continue that on in your midground. I mean, you always say it's like a song, and you're trying to continue on, throughout your garden and tie your garden together. And in that midground, what you're looking for are those mid-sized plants. You're looking for things that are slightly bigger than the trees in your foreground, but much smaller than your trees in your background.
And when talking about like color and contrast with each other, keep in mind that each level you want to have that same color and texture contrast within that level, but then you also want those different levels to have that texture and color contrast amongst the different levels as well. So it's kind of like when you're talking about colors and textures with the foreground, well, that's kind of like a micro level of color and texture contrast. And then you got the next level between the different stages.
Yeah, I mean, colors are super important. You don't want to go bland. You don't want to go with just green in your midground, because if your things are really awesome in your foreground, the things up close, and your midground is kind of boring, your eyes are going to stop in that foreground. And so it's really important to continue that through to the midground and those medium-sized plants, those medium-sized trees, and continue on with interesting colors and textures and shape. I think that diversity is really important because it just continues to draw your eye across your garden. Because what we're doing here is we're adding depth. We're making your garden feel bigger. I think this is one of the things that just really draws your eye across the garden and really makes it more visually interesting. I know Matt and I recently just did a columnar podcast, and we talked about at Wayne and Missy Galloway's garden, and we've got a full tour of that garden on the MrMaple Show on YouTube. But we talk about how if you're looking at the Polito garden, which are all these dwarf conifers, and then she's got this beautiful Arnold Sentinel out there, all of a sudden you realize that this is a big garden and your eyes aren't drawn just to the little miniature trees. And, you know, her background in that instance is actually the views of the mountains in the Blue Ridge Parkway. So, I mean, you've got some gorgeous views in the background, but your eye is drawn across to really enjoy the full garden, which is what you're looking for in that midground.
And something else I like to keep, you know, just to remind people when you kind of start planning these out and plant selections and all that stuff, make sure that you kind of keep a balanced approach to it, that you don't want one of your levels or one of your stages to outperform the next one. You want to just keep that in the back of your mind when you start going through stuff, that you want to keep a balanced approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. I do think that the next stage, though, the background, the taller plants, to me, the fall, that is when I really love the background plantings. And I think sometimes when I garden, I allow that background, since it's in the very back depth, to steal the show in the fall, because there's so many great background trees and background Japanese maples that can perform so well in that fall time frame.
And, you know, we did one on background planting, and we also talked about, you know, screening. But keep in mind, when we talk about background, it doesn't necessarily have to be a screening. It could just be what's back there at the farthest end of the garden. And again, we're talking about depth, so it's to pull you through.
And I think the background is when you use those taller plants that play off of your rest of your garden. You've got your foreground, your midground, and then your background. And if you're not getting contrast, if you're not getting differentiation with your background and, say, whatever is back there, you're not distinguishing where your garden ends and begins.
And this all kind of leads into, so, you know, some people, it might be a little controversial. There might be some people out there be like, well, there's only three. There's your foreground, midground, and background. Why is there a fourth one? And I always add this fourth one because to me, it seems like a lot of people just assume that it's part of the background, but it doesn't just have to be part of the background. But I think gets overlooked is the vertical. And I kind of give the vertical its own category. And
the vertical kind of plays around with what I was talking about with that Arnold Sentinel. Your eye is drawn up when you see that vertical, and you look all across the garden. You're not just looking down, which I think is really important. And the vertical has to be visually interesting and appealing. If it's bland and boring itself, you're not getting much interest out there.
And I think I like how you used the word up. And that's the whole thing with the vertical. It's more than just to pull your depth out, to bring you out. It's also meant to bring your eyes up. And that's important with gardens, is not just going straight out to pull you out that way, but it's important to be able to, because, you know, some of these gardens, and I brought it up before, but Kubota, there's some of those out there where you walked out there. I remember going through there, and you get pulled, and you're just turning your head. And as you're turning your head, then you're turning your head and looking up. And it's such an important part of adding depth is that vertical. And that's why I kind of give it its own category.
Now, hardscaping is always important. You can actually use the hardscaping to tie in between these different stages, be it a wall or it can be a pathway. There's lots of ways you can actually use hardscaping out there, and even use a consistent theme across your garden with your hardscaping in your foreground, your midground, and your background to sort of tie that garden together. Yeah,
with hardscaping, I mean, you can go as easy where you have with hardscaping that where you're using that as a raised, where with the hardscaping that you actually have almost like steps that raise up. Or you can use something like a boulder. You get a bigger boulder on that next level. That just helps add to pulling you in.
So when we're talking about the different stages, you're talking about the foreground, midground, and background, and your vertical. There's different considerations you need to think about when putting any tree in the garden, and I think it's really important to talk about here. One is your environmental considerations. One are the Japanese maples and your companion plants you're putting out in your landscape. Are they hardy in your area? You got to think about your USDA hardiness zones. We've got a whole video on how to figure out your USDA hardiness zone. But guys, if you go to MrMaple.com, we've actually got a USDA hardiness zone thing right there on our website where you can figure out your USDA hardiness zone to figure out if these Japanese maples are going to grow in your area. Now, most Japanese maples are goods in zones 5 through 9. Coral bark selections typically in that 6 through 9 area. So keep that in mind. We have all that information on our website so you can figure out if these Japanese maples or other unique, rare, interesting trees can grow in your area.
Yeah, and you back on the, with the environmental, just like anything, drainage. Drainage is important. You want to make sure that you have healthy soil for whatever medium that you're going to be using.
Yeah, I think drainage is critical for Japanese maples. Some companion plants, like say a dawn redwood, can handle a wetter area. So think about that when you're placing trees around your yard, around your landscape. If you have a wetter area, use a tree that can handle that wet, boggier condition. A bald cypress, a metasequoia, those dawn redwoods, they can handle those situations where you can get an ornamental tree in that wetter spot in your yard where a Japanese maple can't grow. So think about that as part of your consideration.
And then obviously sun and shade. And I want to just talk a little bit about with sun and shade that with these, with depth and foreground, not only is it important to know what your trees and your companion plants can handle when it comes to sun and shade, but you can use sun and shade as part of adding to that depth. Because if we're talking about in the background, we could use something that's bigger to create shade for something in front of it. So if you have that background, those trees could be creating shade for that midground that will be the perfect environment for what's in front of it. So sun and shade is a little bit more than just can my tree handle the sun and shade, but you can use that to create more depth.
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about as well. Sun and shade characteristics, that's something to always take consideration whenever you're putting in the landscape. But when you're gardening, you can be thinking, hey, this tree is going to get very large here and provide shade for these other trees out here in the landscape. And some people don't have a blank landscape to start with. Some people actually have large oak trees or large tulip poplars or large pines throughout their garden. And, you're in a more shaded situation, and you got to think about when you're putting these trees out there, are these trees going to really have color that will make this garden pop even in the shaded situation?
And then when we kind of get away from the environmental considerations, you start getting into like size. What is my growth habit for this tree? How big is it going to get? So where does this tree fit in my different levels? Is it going to be in the foreground? Is it going to be in the midground? Is it going to be in the background? Size is always important to remember. And when we talk about size, it's not just what size it is then for what level, but how big is that going to eventually get?
Yeah, and with size, you also start thinking shape. You've got Japanese maples that are short plateaus. You've got Japanese maples like Ryusen and Golden Falls that you can stake up, and they have a straight cascading weeping down habit that you could have this fountain-like effect, or you can not stake it up and have a ground cover. You're thinking about things when you're even talking about lace leaves. You've got trees like Crimson Queen that are short and they grow wide. And then you've got trees like Tamukiyama that are also weeping, but they have a more arching out habit. So they're a little bit taller. And then with Japanese maples, you've got semi-uprights, where you've got trees that are upright and their branches are semi-cascading outward. Then you start to get branches on Japanese maples that, are upright. There are so much variation when it comes to the shape of a Japanese maple. There's differences between Japonicums and Shirasanums and Palmatums. And then we go to Palmatums. Like I said, we've got 1,500 different varieties. And the shape on every variety is different. And I think that's important because it allows you so much diversity to be able to figure out.
And I think you just answered the question, why do Japanese maples work so well in all these different levels and all these steps? You just answered why Japanese maples? I think you just answered that question.
And the habit is in there with that shape. because we've got with Japanese maples, not only are we talking about the way the structure is on the tree, but when you talk about habit, you also start looking at things like Makawi Etabusa that has this tightly layering habit. The leaves are so tightly together, it gives something that's very unique out there in the garden. When you start talking about habit, you start talking about trees that just have, Germain's gyration. It has that weeping habit, but it's also kind of twisted and contorted. I mean, there's so much cool habit that you can choose with Japanese maples. That's why I love them. They're one of my favorite trees. And, needless to say, the next characteristic of color, I mean, how can you beat that with any other tree but a Japanese maple?
You can't. And then within that color, you can break it down. It's not just, what is the color of that tree, but you've got Japanese maples have different seasonal interests. And that's something to keep in mind with color is those different seasonal interests. And to me, I always try to approach when designing a garden, I try to think of it like you've mentioned, a song or a symphony. And I always think of, if you've ever gone and listened to a symphony play, there might be a time that it's the string section. They're shining and they're just tearing it up, but then they kind of back off, and then the woodwinds or a horn section, they have their different moments. And that's another thing with Japanese maples, because they have spring interest. You can choose one for the color depending on the one you want it. So you have if you want to have something that's orange, well, you can have that orange happening during fall, whereas during the other months, you can have it, like a waterfall. It might be green, but it's time to show. It's when it's playing its solo, when its section could be that fall. So keep that in mind, the different changings of the seasons with those colors.
Yeah, and you got the spring, summer, fall, and winter. If you go to the spring, there's Japanese maples are known for their spring interest. Summer, there's actually tons of Japanese maples that have unique summer interests, like Orangeola. I mean, they just got this amazing colors across during the summer. Mila shows off and rocks out during the summer months. I mean, there's so many Japanese maples that continue to provide interest even in the summer time frame. People often underrate Japanese maples in the summer. There's so many new selections out here that are summer interest Japanese maples. Fall, they shine. They rock it out during the fall. And during the winter, some of the structures on Japanese maples, the regal presence, are amazing. But that's when the coral bark selections shine. We've got 20-something different varieties of coral barks here at MrMaple. So there's a lot of selection in the bark color, from yellow, orange, multicolored, green, and red. I mean, there's a lot to choose from whenever it comes to those coral bark selections that shine during those winter months.
And then that obviously takes us into texture. And when we talk about texture, we could be talking about foliage texture. We could be talking, you talked about habit. Are we talking about texture? You brought up Germain's gyration. The way it twists and contorts creates texture on the bark. You brought up coral bark. Is it color, that's creating that texture? Or do we have something that, that the bark will kind of cork up? So there's so many different things to keep in mind with texture. Is it the texture of the leaves? Are we talking about lace leaf versus like a moonrise with a big leaf? You got those textures, but you also have the textures of the habit of the tree with the barks and all that stuff to keep in mind.
Yeah, the diversity of the texture. Most people think about texture of a Japanese maple with a lace leaf, and you've got this lace leaf that is beautiful out there, really elegant. And then you've got this bloodgood style leaf for some of the uprights. And it is, very appealing. But then you look at the texture of the foliage of something like a Shishigashira, small, crumpled leaf, really visually interesting. It draws your appearance, your texture, it draws the texture and the attention to the texture so much that it makes your garden visually appealing. And then on the opposite side of things, you've got those big Acer japonicum leaves. Just gives it huge texture. It looks like a dinner plate out there. It looks tropical. Y'all, Japanese maples have a lot of awesome characteristics. And you need to think about each of these through the foreground, midground, and background. We're going to go through here now and start talking about each of these, the foreground, midground, background, and vertical, and give you some good recommendations for us for for you, for your garden, in that foreground, that midground, that background, and the vertical, with both Japanese maples and some great companion plants, all that you can find typically on MrMaple.com. If we're currently sold out of any of the ones we're talking about, you can actually go click notify me, and we'll notify you when those trees become available again.
So when we started talking about, putting this together, and we said foreground, and I'm like, dwarfs. I mean, and that's going to be kind of your go-to for your foreground. Since we talked about before, it's something that you want to keep lower. You don't want to block the next level, but you want to create that's your first impression. So you really want to do that. But so dwarfs are really, really good to use in that foreground area. And I mean, who can beat King Makawa?
Yeah, I mean, Makawa Yatsubusa, it's one of our favorites. We talk about it all the time. Dwarf compact layering habit, chartreuse green leaves, visually appealing. It's one of those trees that people say looks like a little bonsai out there. I've had people at Swan Lake Iris Gardens, they said, have you seen our Dr. Seuss tree? Because it looks like something out of a children's book. I mean, it is very appealing, looks cartoonesque, and it is one of those trees that looks like it's alive. It's these arms out there, and it looks like it's these arms covered in this really lively kind of like green kind of fur. I mean, it looks unusual, different. Makawa Yatsubusa, slow growing, looks bonsai-esque. I mean, it's hard to describe exactly what Makawa is because it evokes emotions in the garden. And I think that's one of the things that's so visually appealing about it.
And I think I'm going to have to get a picture of your parents' Makawa, because we're talking about depth, pulling in. So like your parents at your parents' house, when you're standing out the entrance to the garden, you're standing outside, there's the entrance, but when you look into that entrance, you're immediately met with that Makawa Yatsubusa. And you're talking about that depth that immediately draws you in. And, whenever I see it, it makes me want to, okay, I'm going to step through this walkway and get pulled in. Makawa Yatsubusa is a great one for that, just for that reason. Like you say, that shape and that texture just pulls you in.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really important is that presence that will draw you into the landscape. And that's what Makawa does. As soon as you're walking into the garden, you see that Makawa there, you think, man, what is here in the rest of this garden, because this tree is so interesting. And you start looking across the landscape because that Makawa is right there.
It does. It pulls you in. And like you say, that's what you go through that. And then after that, what's what makes you want to go further into the garden, adding that depth.
Now, another great dwarf to add some red color out there in that foreground is Shana, a dwarf mutation that was found on the University of Illinois' campus. It's about 9 foot up in a Japanese maple right there on the University of Department of Public Safety, and it is amazing. I mean, it's now worldwide. It's a dwarf compact tree now that will get 3 to 4 feet in height, 3 to 4 foot in width in 10 years. It was found and named. It was named after one of our good friends, Billy Schwartz's daughter, Shana, which is Hebrew for beautiful. And it is such a compact red Japanese maple that is cherry red in the spring, maroon during the summer, and can be some really bright shades of red in the fall.
Every time I see Shana, it makes me think of Billy Schwartz. And I know this is kind of off of this, but y'all go check out the podcast with Billy Schwartz. That dude's a hoot.
The Billy Schwartz Experience is what it's called. You should check it out. He was Muhammad Ali's lawyer during the Joe Frazier fights. So, I mean, some really fun stuff that he talks about in there. I'm just going to go ahead and ruin it for you. He says that he threw the fight. So that is pretty crazy stuff. Shana, though, is an easy tree to use in the landscape. That add that red color because you're going to want to have the diversity in colors across your landscape, and you can start to tie in that red color with a small Shana in that foreground.
And then moving from there, we were talking and Pink Princess. I mean, you're talking about something that's going to fit that foreground because of its size, its habit, its shape, but then its colors are just, I mean, they're just magical.
I mean, I love variegation. I like to have variegation up close. You hear me talk about that all the time. This is a way to have that variegation in that foreground, but continue to have that depth in the landscape. Many variegated Japanese maples may be a little bit taller, and there's a trade-off there in the landscape with your depth. We're not talking today about designing a garden with just a blank slate. We're talking about designing a garden with the idea to add depth to your garden. And when you have something like Pink Princess, you get that variegation everybody loves, but also it doesn't block your vision of the rest of your garden because it has that small, compact form. Pink Princess was found as a dwarf mutation, like Shayna, like that witch's broom, on the cultivar Benishishinga by our friend Carl Munn. He sent us signwood and allowed us to introduce it under the name Pink Princess that we put on it. And we introduced it into the trade because it has that compact form, and it's really more stable than the cultivar Benishishinga. Benishishinga has this sort of pink variegation around each and every, like this pink margin variegation around each and every leaf in the early spring, that then later goes to like a creamy white. And, you know, it is very colorful, but now you get that in a compact, rounded form with Pink Princess. Amazing tree to have right there in the foreground.
And I like how you mentioned having variegation up front, because sometimes with variegation, if you have it too far back, it kind of loses its oomph, that they're not always. So being able to have it in the foreground, you really get to see it. So when you look out, you really get to see that variegation.
So let's quickly talk about some companion plants in the foreground, because, you know, you're not going to use just Japanese maples in your landscape unless you're us here at Mr. Maple. We've done that at Maplewood Gardens, completely Japanese maples. And we have a lot of depth there as well, because we planned it to, you know, really play with the vision and the colors. But if you're looking to put other trees out there in your landscape with your Japanese maples, a great idea in that foreground are Satsuki azaleas. Satsuki is a term that means fifth month. It's because they start to bloom in that late kind of spring time frame and through the summer. They have larger blooms to them, but they are short and compact. A variety like Suki no Shimo, it's interesting very texturally as well. It's got a cupped leaf. It reminds me almost like of a Shishigashira-like azalea, but then it has these large 2.5 inch to 3 inch pink blossoms that are just amazing.
And, you know, you mentioned the timing of when you're going to get those blooms, and that kind of goes back to that symphony idea. You kind of know when this is going to happen, so you can plan with your companion plants and your Japanese maples that when that's going to happen, and that could be that section's area of your garden. That's when it's performing.
And then another thing on companions we're talking about are some dwarf conifers. Dwarf conifers are nice to have out in the landscape, especially with Japanese maples, because they play off of each other. Most dwarf conifers, they give you a consistent thing spring, summer, fall, and winter. You get some amazing evergreen out there in some of these conifers, and they play off of your Japanese maples, because when you have something out there that's consistent year round, then when the Japanese maple has a different color in the spring, different color in the summer, different color in the fall, drops its leaves, you start to get contrast and the diversity out there in the garden.
And I think a great one, green penguin. You're talking about, and for me, for a green penguin is the shape of it and how just kind of condensed it is, but it's going to stay small. So using it for that color and texture, up next to a Japanese maple, I just think is a great companion plant.
Now, green penguin, if you're not familiar with it, has the shape of a little penguin. We're talking 3 feet in height by about 1 foot in width in 10 years. So you've got a really small growing, it almost fits in the vertical category because it has the vertical interest, but it's so short. So I don't know if I can put it in the vertical category or not, because 3 foot in 10 years, it doesn't get too big. But it gives you a nice green color, and texturally it's very appealing as well because it has short needles and long needles on the same tree. So it's not just your typical pine tree out there. It looks like a little lively creature out there.
And then hydrangeas. Hydrangeas make great companion plants with Japanese maples. But since we're talking about in the foreground, we want to go with something that we know is going to stay smaller. So some small, hydrangeas, and hence the name Munchkin. You can't go wrong with that. But you're getting those big blooms, and then the foliage on them, they're going to contrast with those Japanese maples in that foreground as well.
Yeah, I love Munchkin because it's a hydrangea quercifolia, which are some of my favorite hydrangeas. The oak leaf hydrangeas have a leaf that looks like an oak leaf and some amazing fall colors as well. So you get some amazing change of the seasons on this small hydrangea. Munchkin, I think peewee would work as well. Mm-hmm. They are small, compact forms that are easy because they're not going to block a lot of vision. that you may put in that foreground, but then you get these large white blooms on there as well.
And then that foreground is a great place to use like a Japanese forest grass. You know, it's not going to get too big. It's not going to get too high, but it's going to add that texture and color as your first view of the garden. You're going to see that. And it's almost kind of, you know, when the wind blows and you see that flow through, that's also movement. So depth is to create movement essentially. And something like, you know, Japanese grass, when the wind blows, helps create that movement through the garden.
And we've been trying to cover and carry more Japanese forest grass here at Mr. Maple. We've been carrying all gold and areola. Both of those can give you some of the yellow color out there in the landscape. They can add a lot to your garden texturally, and they're just so visually appealing, and they can be the beginning of adding that yellow color in the foreground that you can continue in that midground and all the way through to your background.
So that leads us into that midground level. And we were talking about, you know, that color and texture. And so this is a great place too. With texture, we recommend, you know, we talked about Maikujaku. So we're talking about something that has those bigger leaves that will help you draw into the garden.
And I think with Maikujaku, it's maybe a mid-sized to larger tree. It is slower growing than something like Emmett's pumpkin, which we wouldn't have put here in the midground because it's so much faster growing. But Maikujaku, maybe put it towards that mid to back part of your midground so that it's not really overpowering on its size. But the leaf texture are so visually interesting. You've got that large leaf that is just so huge, but the leaf itself can look like a peacock. And so it's deeply divided, like a peacock displaying its feathers. So it's so deeply divided, and when fall hits, it's outrageous. I mean, that's really what Maikujaku and many of the Japonicums are known for. But in the spring and the summer, you have these large green leaves that give you this tropical feel that is so visually appealing, especially because of its large leaf and great texture it adds.
And then this next one we're going to suggest is summer gold. And the reason we talk about summer gold is because that yellow color, and yellow brightens. And sometimes as you start getting through a landscape, you start getting farther back into it, it tends to get darker. So something like a summer gold, you get that yellow to help brighten up, but it's a mid-size. And then, you know, it has some spring interest when you get that red border around that yellow. I mean, it's just a killer tree.
I mean, I love summer gold because it can handle more sun than many other yellows. It's a good mid-sized tree out there in the landscape, and the yellow really starts, and especially in that midground, starts to bring out all of the other colors in the landscape. It starts to play off and allow you to see every shade of green and contrast so well against your reds and your blues. It is outstanding out there in the landscape, and as a mid-sized tree, it's visually very interesting, especially because it can give you some really bright shades of yellow.
And sticking to those colors, geisha gone wild, you're talking about just, you know, the habit of it, but when you get that early spring and before you get into that summer and you got those pinks, purples, that variegation, it's such a flashy tree that it just naturally makes you want to look further in, keep looking. So it's going to draw you. I
mean, that pink color is so visually stimulating in a garden that it's going to draw your eye out that far. I mean, you start looking in that midground because you're like, that is amazing, especially in the spring and the fall when it's at its most intense colors. It is so attractive out there in the landscape and garden. Geisha Gone Wild in the tree that's going to be about in that 8-foot range in 10 years. So it's not a very large Japanese maple, but it fits in that midground very well.
Geisha Gone Wild, it's such a, there's so many different applications you can use Geisha Gone Wild. So, we did a podcast before and we talked about how, focal point planting. And so don't be afraid in these different levels to apply those different aspects. So you can have that focal point planting in your midground, or you can have that focal point planting in your foreground or your background. But again, it's more about habit and size and texture. But don't be afraid to use a tree as your focal point, because you can have more than one focal point in your different levels.
Oh yeah, and you should go check out our focal point planting with Japanese maples, Landscaping Your Garden by Mr. Maple on YouTube. We got a full video on there on the Mr. Maple Show. Y'all, next up, I got Benikawa. Now, you could probably use some of the even more dwarf selections of coral barks in your foreground, but Benikawa fits in your midground very well. It's a mid-sized upright coral bark, so it gives you some really nice red bark during that winter interest. Now, I like to give it some sort of backdrop, so it's great to put in that midground because you can use other trees in your background to really show off the bark color. You can use some evergreens. You can use a backdrop of a building. There's lots of things you can put behind it to really show off the bark color of Benikawa. But it also fits so well here in the midground because in the fall it goes to a nice clear yellow, and so it plays off many of your other colors of trees in your landscape.
And you go from fall into winter, so it gives you that winter interest. It gives you, so, a lot of people think that, oh, it's winter, there's nothing to look at in the garden. Well, this gives you something to look at in the garden during the winter months.
So let's hit up some companion plants for that midground. First, I'm going to start off with some of the Kurume azaleas. Hino Crimson, it's a classic. It's the Kurume azaleas, they have blooms that are so prolific in the spring you can barely see the leaves themselves. The Kurume azaleas were developed by one of the fathers of samurai in Japan. So cool history behind them. But they're really beautiful out there. Hino Crimson gives you some great red color. It's probably one of the most popular Kurume azaleas out there today. They're a good mid-sized azalea that's very cold tolerant and can really perform in many places in the country.
And then we talked about hydrangeas. I know we talked about some of the smaller hydrangeas, but again, we can keep that same theme moving through those different levels by using a hydrangea in that midground as well.
Yeah, I mean, something like Hydrangea macrophylla, pennymac, that's a classic, one of those, really beautiful bloom hydrangeas that can be blue to pink depending on the pH of the soil. I think that's an excellent mid-sized hydrangea. It's a classic one that many people enjoy and can give you some interesting blooms that are very visually interesting, even in that midground, because you can see those larger blooms from a distance.
And then keeping on that whole, bloom theme, camellias make such great companion plants. But again, with that symphony, you can almost, depending on the type of camellia you choose, know when you're going to get your blooms. So then, before we're talking about Benikawa as your winter interest, well, then you can talk about having a camellia that's going to give you blooms. That's going to be part of your winter interest, part of your symphony.
Yeah, I mean, something like Camellia sasanqua, Shishigashira, it's a semi-double. It's got some gorgeous pink blooms to it, and it blooms in late fall through early winter. It's a good mid-sized camellia, too. I mean, some camellias could probably be in your background, but this is a good mid-sized camellia, typically 5 to 6 foot in 10 years. So it can give you some of that evergreen backdrop that maybe you could even put something like Benikawa in front of to be able to see that amazing bark.
And then how can we leave conifers out as a companion plant for the midground? So we're talking about gold drift. I mean, you can stake it up and get a little height to it. But I mean, you're just talking about a killer tree that color-wise, texture-wise, habit-wise, shape-wise, fits all the boxes.
And this is one of those ones where you're going to want to give it some sunlight because the sunlight hitting the needles is actually going to cause it some yellow color. But if you stake it up, you can give some really nice interest out there with a unique habit, with its strongly weeping habit, but a good evergreen out there that's going to give you not just evergreen, but evergreenly yellow.
And then moving on from that midground, now we're start talking about that background. We're talking about that final level that's going to pull you to the very back of that garden. And Shinda Sojo, how can you not put that on the list?
I mean, Shinda Sojo is unique in the spring, gives you some fire engine red color in the spring, some green color in the summer, and then some fire engine red again in the fall. So it really plays off with the changes of the seasons and can give you some dynamic interest that is visually appealing, but also can be a part of your symphony in the spring, summer, or fall.
And then keeping with that yellow, and like I mentioned before, a lot of times you get into a garden and you get to those larger trees that are in the back and it gets dark. So why not a hot blonde? Something that especially if there's sun back there, it's got vigor, it's going to get up there. You're going to get those yellows that are going to brighten up the garden. And then you talk about that fall. It goes to that red during the fall. Why not?
I like Hot Blonde because it gets out there and it gets out there quick. So it can make this background planting in a fairly relatively fast time frame. It's one of the faster growing maples we've ever grown. We introduced it here at Mr. Maple because it's extremely heat tolerant. So if you've got a sun situation, it can handle that better than most other trees. But I mean, it is outrageous on its yellow color in the garden. And if you're tying that yellow from the Japanese forest grass to the summer gold, this can be part of that yellow theme continuing across that draws your eye across the entire garden. You know, Shinda Sojo helps do that too with those brighter colors. Those brighter colors allow you to really be able to experience that full garden across. But beside that Hot Blonde, a great idea is to give it something to play and give that color contrast against. And something like an Emperor One gives you that deep maroon color. An Emperor One or a Bloodgood will give you that deep red color out there in the landscape and will allow it to play off of that yellow color very easily.
And then I think, you know, when we made this list, I think we're thinking fall, because Osakazuki, I mean, you're talking about something that's going to get up there, it's going to fill that in, but, you know, is going to steal the show with that red in the background that's going to pull you through. So especially during the fall, that red's going to pull you all the way through.
And those are just some of the maple recommendations. If you want to see more about background planting, you know, we're about to get into some companion plants in the background, but if you want to see more about background planting with Japanese maples, check out our video, Background Planting with Japanese Maples, Landscaping Your Garden with Mr. Maple, on our YouTube channel. We've got a full video all about that.
And then, so with that, like anything, you want to have some companion plants back there in your background. So Metasequoia ogon, I like this one because during the winter months, it gives you that bark texture interest back there. So, I mean, to me, to be able to have that, because we talk about, this is all about color, texture, and depth to move you. Man, any of those Metasequoias, just the way the shapes and the way they look, you know, don't let up. The winter interest on them are, to me, just as fascinating.
And then when you get the yellow color in the spring and the summer is probably one of the most intense. It is outrageous. You get some really nice kind of like burnt kind of oranges out of it in the fall as well. So it's an amazing 4-season plant out there, but it's a deciduous conifer. It gets out there quickly, but it can be another thing like that Hot Blonde that can continue that yellow theme to your backdrop to really liven up the garden and allow you to experience the full garden and the full depth of what you're seeing.
And then, you know, again, we're sticking with that. And so Cedrus atlantica glauca, I mean, just perfect choice for a background planting.
Yeah, I mean, glauca means blue. It's a blue atlas cedar out there. It can get out there fast as well. Unlike Metasequoia ogon, which can handle those wetter spots in the garden, you're going to want to make sure that Cedrus atlantica glauca is actually in a drier spot. But it is amazing on its evergreenness and its ever blueness out there in the garden. It gives you a blue color you can't get out of many other trees. And this is just a fun color to have in the garden. I mean, blue plays so well off of your reds and your greens, and especially your yellows. I mean, the color contrast of the yellow and blue is outrageous. So think about using those blue atlas cedars, or even some of those. And if you do use something like a blue atlas cedar in your background, think about using some other blue conifers in your midground and your foreground to tie it all together.
And then we had to add this last one as a background companion plant. And I think a lot of times with background planting, we forget about using something that blooms in the background. A lot of times, you know, we treat it as just a screen. The background is just a screen. But using something like a dogwood that has those blooms as your background adds so much depth.
And I think when you choose something for the background that's blooming, it has to be a prolific bloomer. I mean, you need to go with something like a Caenathus retussus or a Cornus cusa, because you get blooms all across the tree, especially if you use something like Celestial or Venus. Those are some of the Rutgers hybrids developed by the University of Rutgers that are Chinese dogwoods that have really large blooms, but the blooms can coat almost the entire tree. And so they're a summer bloomer, so you get some white blooms out there in the distance, which is fun because you can play off of some of your white colors, like your white colors on your blooms, that we talked about on some of your dwarf oak leaf hydrangeas in your foreground?
So we've talked about foreground, midground, and background. And here's that fourth one that some of you might be like, well, this is not really one of your levels, but I make it one because it's so important to that movement, to that depth, and that's that vertical. And for a vertical interest, there's so many different things that, why are we adding vertical interest? One, it's to move our heads up. And when you move your head up, it causes you to look out. So that's going to create that depth. But you also might be you might have something that you're trying to hide. There might be something there that you want to block. And that's where that some of these recommendations, these verticals can really come in handy. Something like a Twombly's Red Sentinel, perfect tree for the add verticality. And
now something to mention is that the vertical trees that we talk about here are all columnar plants, because our idea here is that we're trying to add depth to the landscape. So if we have something that gets very wide, when you're choosing something that's vertical, you're blocking something else in the landscape. So you're making your landscape look smaller. So when we're trying to add depth with the vertical, we're choosing columnar plants. If you're very interested in more columnar plants, check out our recent podcast on our top 25 columnar trees for small gardens. We go through and talk about 25 different columnar trees that you could use to add this vertical interest. Now, Twombly's, like you're mentioning, that is an amazing narrow growing tree. It gives you cherry red color in the spring, summer, and in the fall, it gives you some fire engine red colors. It has that sort of glowing effect that almost Fire Glow does, but in a narrow, compact shape. So it can give you that red color and just be that flagpole of red out there in their garden.
And, since we're talking about those columnar, those shape, how can you not mention Tsukasa Silhouette?
Yeah, Tsukasa Silhouette is a selection by Tsukasa Maple in Japan. It's narrow, it's fast growing, it's upright. Give it sunlight to keep its more narrow shape. If you grow it in more shade, it will be wider. So keep that in mind. But an amazing fall color, upright green Japanese maple that can add that vertical interest very easily.
I love looking at that picture of you and Matt standing in front of it. And just looking at that picture, you can see, you look at the picture and it's the three of you standing there in front of that tree. And that's the first thing you're going to look at. But then as you're looking at the picture, your eyes naturally go up that tree. And that's what we're talking about, adding depth. So even looking at the tree in a picture creates depth in a picture. It's going to create that depth for your vertical interest in a garden.
Hey, I think if you know how big Matt and I are, you can compare it to the narrowness of the Tsukasa Silhouette to realize how awesome this tree is to use in the landscape. You've probably seen many of our videos before, so check out that photos. You can see how small and narrow the Tsukasa Silhouettes are. He did prune them a little bit during the summer to keep a slightly more narrow shape, but it has a natural shape naturally, which is awesome because the branches arch upward. Another narrow Japanese maple that I love is the Oolong Do maple. It's Acer pseudosubordinum Taka cements. It's a fantastic native growing Japanese maple to Oolong Do Island. And that's an island between Japan and North Korea. And they get some Siberian winds that hit it. It's a really cold area on that island, oddly enough. And it is amazing. It's got a round full moon style leaf, but it is a narrow vertical interest Japanese maple that can give you amazing fall color out there. So you can play with having that out there in the landscape, and it's not going to take up a lot of width, and you can continue adding depth to your landscape.
So we've got some Japanese maples to add that vertical interest. How about some of the, some companion plants that we can throw in to get that same goal?
Yeah, and one thing you can do that with is Cylinder Silhouette. We talked about Tsukasa Silhouette. Don Shadow actually helped with that name with Tsukasa Maple. Cylinder Silhouette is his introduction of a narrow growing sweet gum, fast growing, 2 to 3 feet of growth in a year, but it's a liquid ambar and it's durable, but it goes really fast. So in 10 years, it may be somewhere between 25 and 30 feet. And if it's 25 to 30 feet, it may only be 4 to 5 foot in width. So it can really add some unique and really large vertical out there in the landscape, and it can add it quickly.
And I won't lie, this next companion plant, I've put a lot of these in landscapes because they were requested. And here in the United States, you all will know this name. You're going to know what it looks like. It's very popular in American landscape now. But I don't think I had an appreciation for it until I learned the backstory. And once I learned that backstory of it, there's this new appreciation for it, and that's sky pencil.
I mean, that's a dwarf Japanese holly. It's Ilex crenata, but it's slow growing and it's got extremely narrow shape. It was actually a selection by one of the, I guess you would say, like the godfathers of Japanese gardening, Mr. Shibamichi-san. We actually got to go visit him. He is an extraordinary plantsman. He's introduced some amazing plants throughout his time, and sky pencil is probably his most popular tree, but he doesn't get credit for it. I mean, we went to his place in the snow, and he takes us out and shows us, like this variegated sport that looks like a little witch's broom on a green ceiling that he had in a maybe a 1 or 2 gallon container in his yard. And he really has an eye for Japanese gardening. And this is a really nice tree that can be as a screen. It can be put to give you vertical interest in that foreground, but also in that midground. So, I mean, it's one of the smaller vertical interests, but it does give you that vertical interest at narrow shape.
And the foliage texture on it contrasts with other things so well. And I think that's why you see in American landscape, it's used quite a bit, but there's a reason why. And I think a lot of it has to do with that columnar shape, but the texture of those leaves against other trees, that foliage is just outstanding.
Now, next up, we've got Thuya occidentalis Groot Spire. This is a narrow-growing arborvitae that is slow-growing, but it also is extremely narrow. We're talking 6 to 8 foot, maybe 6 foot in 10 years, and maybe 1.5 feet wide. So, I mean, it is really narrow in its habit, giving vertical interest without a lot of width. Again, this adds depth to your garden. Great for that in that foreground to midground because you're not blocking a lot of vision with that narrow habit.
And then this last one is a companion plant. I said, Tim, we need a conifer that has some variegation. And the reason I say that is, again, sometimes when you start getting into the backgrounds or you start getting up there, they can get dark. And this next one, Sparkling Arrow, gives you contrast, but it can help lighten up a garden.
I mean, it really can. And I love Sparkling Arrow. It's a Chamaecyparis nucatensis. It's an Alaskan cedar, sometimes called Cupressus nucatensis. If they start to get some width at their base, we often call that a skirt. We prune that out and allow it to give more of that vertical interest up top. It will be very tall and narrow, but they don't have these branches that sort of hang down every once in a while. That is very interesting in the landscape. So it's not just your straight columnar plant, but it looks like a little creature out there, a really tall creature. And it is amazing. The Sparkling Arrow with the green, with the white variegation on top of the creamy white variegation, outstanding. It's a very good sport of green arrow, which can also add you some vertical interest out there. This is a plant that I like to have in the back of the midground to the background because it's so visually interesting. I wouldn't, I might put it somewhere in the midground, but I wouldn't put it always up close because you're going to be looking up at the tree. And so you'll be looking up at the sky rather than the rest of your garden. So, I mean, amazing, awesome tree to add that vertical interest out there in the landscape and garden.
So we're talking about that movement and that depth. So just keep these things in mind when you go out there. And something to keep in mind is these are not all things that, like you said, not everyone's going to have a blank slate to work with. And so keep in mind, just because you don't have a blank slate doesn't mean you can't apply these to the different levels in your garden. And again, you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but these don't have to be large spaces. You can have a smaller yard, a smaller garden, and apply all these into that development and the design and your choices of plants.
So really take this thought process and these considerations into factors and figuring out what you're going to plant in that foreground, that midground, the background, and what you're going to use in that vertical to really draw that eye out in the landscape. Because the idea here is we're adding depth to your garden. We're trying to get you to tie in the yellow across so that you follow that yellow across your landscape, not just up close. You tie in that variegation so you can see it across. You tie in the white blooms, the pink blooms, whatever you're using across your landscapes to add that depth in your garden.
And I would love to hear what you all would recommend for your different levels. So in the comments below, let us know what Japanese maples you've used in your different levels in your own garden.
Y'all, thanks so much for joining us today. Take care.
God bless.
and have a great day.